Thank you. This is our ninth segment of our study, and our study has been on the 8 covenants of the Bible. As of our last broadcast, we completed a study of the first 7 of these covenants. So with this broadcast, I want to begin moving towards the study of the 8th and last of the covenants of the Bible. Now, by way of a quick summary again, of these 8 covenants, 3 were made with humanity in general, and these were the Edenic covenant, the Adamic covenant, and the Noahic covenant. The Edenic covenant was conditional and it's no longer in effect. The Adamic and the Noahic were unconditional, and they are still very much in effect to this day, but those covenants were made with humanity in general. The last 5 covenants were made specifically with the nation of Israel. Of these 5 covenants, 1 was conditional, and that was the Mosaic covenant, and the Mosaic covenant is no longer in effect. It is over and done with, and the Mosaic law is no longer operative today. The other 4 covenants that God made with Israel are all unconditional and eternal, and largely unfulfilled to this day. One covenant of these 4 unconditional covenants is really the foundation for the other 3. The key covenant is the Abrahamic covenant, which we detailed to some extent in these studies. And the Abrahamic covenant can be reduced to 3 key areas, or 3 aspects. The Abrahamic covenant had a land aspect, it had a seed aspect, and it had a spiritual blessings aspect. And the other 3 covenants, each one develops one specific aspect. And so we saw how the Palestinian covenant developed the land aspect of the Abrahamic covenant, and pointed out that although the enjoyment of the land by the Jews is conditional on their obedience, as the Mosaic covenant pointed out, their ownership and possession of the land is not conditioned by their obedience, because it was granted to Israel unconditionally. Then the second aspect, the seed aspect, was further developed by the Davidic covenant. We pointed out that under the Abrahamic covenant, the Messiah was to be of the seed of Abraham, but that meant he could be of any of the 12 tribes of Israel. But later in Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, it was limited further in that it had to be of the tribe of Judah. But now with the Davidic covenant, it was limited even further, and that is the Messiah would have to be of the tribe of the house of David. The Messiah had to be of the seed of Abraham, and then further of the seed of Judah, and then even further of the seed of David. In Jeremiah chapter 22, verses 24 through 30, it was narrowed even further, and that is that you had to be a member of the house of David, but apart from Jeconiah. Joseph was a member of the house of David apart from Jeconiah. Fortunately, he was not the real father of Jesus, but Jesus' mother, Mary, was a member of the house of David, apart from Jeconiah, as her genealogy in Luke chapter 3 clearly does show. Now, the third aspect of the Abrahamic covenant was the aspect of spiritual blessings. And that aspect is to be developed by this 8th covenant, which is the covenant we're about to study, called the New Covenant. And the content of the New Covenant is found in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, which reads as follows. Behold, the days come, saith Jehovah, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers in that day that I took them by the hand to bring them up out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them, saith Jehovah. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith Jehovah. I will put my law in their inward parts, and in their hearts will I write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith Jehovah. And I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Now this covenant is clearly made between God and Israel, with both houses of Israel, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And this covenant has further confirmations and elaborations in other passages, and you'll find the new covenant also mentioned in Isaiah chapter 55 verse 3, Isaiah chapter 59 verse 21, Isaiah chapter 61 verses 8 and 9, Jeremiah chapter 32 verse 40, Ezekiel chapter 16 verse 60, Ezekiel chapter 34 verses 35 to 41, Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 26 to 28, and finally Romans chapter 11 verses 26 and 27. And from the original covenant words in Jeremiah 31 verses 31 through 34, and plus these other confirmations, what we see are 8 specific provisions. 8 provisions in this covenant. Number 1, it is an unconditional covenant involving God and both houses of Israel, according to Jeremiah 31:31. It's not merely made between Judah and God, and not only between Israel and God, but includes both houses of Israel, and so it includes the entire Jewish nation. It includes all descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Secondly, according to verse 32, this covenant, the new covenant, is distinct from the Mosaic covenant. So it is not merely an elaboration of the Mosaic covenant, but totally distinct from it. In fact, it is ultimately to replace it, because the Mosaic covenant was already in Jeremiah's day considered broken, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them. The third provision in this covenant is that it promises the regeneration of Israel. This is found in Jeremiah 31:33, but also in Isaiah chapter 59, verse 21. The third provision is the promise of a national salvation of Israel. Now, while it's elaborating the spiritual blessings of the Abrahamic covenant, the key aspect of spiritual blessing is the blessing of salvation. So included in the provisions of this covenant is Israel's national regeneration, Israel's national salvation. The fourth provision in this covenant is that this regeneration of Israel is to be universal among all Jews. This is brought out by Jeremiah 31:34, but also Isaiah 61, verse 9. The national salvation is to extend to every single individual Jewish person, and it will remain true in all succeeding generations from the time that the initial regeneration occurs. The Jews will be saved as a nation. All Jews will be saved in the closing days of the tribulation. But even Jews who are born into the kingdom are also going to become believers. So during the Messianic kingdom, while there will be unbelievers in the kingdom, all unbelievers will be among the Gentiles only. But among the Jews, there will be no unsaved Jews, and that is the reason verse 34 says, There will be no need for one Jew to tell another Jew to know the Lord, for they shall all know him. So in other words, a day is coming that REL ministries will go out of business, because there will be no longer a need to tell Jews to know the Lord. And we exist for this very purpose, to tell our fellow Jewish people to know the Lord through Jesus the Messiah. Now the fifth provision in verse 34 is the forgiveness of sin. The new covenant will do that very thing which the Mosaic covenant was not capable of doing. While the Mosaic covenant gave the Jews a knowledge of what righteousness and what sin is, it never gave the Jews the power to keep the righteousness of the law and to keep from sinning. And so the best the Mosaic covenant could do regarding sins was to cover the sins of Israel. But the new covenant is going to take these sins away and not merely cover them, and so there'll be an absolute forgiveness of Jewish sins as a result. Now the sixth provision is found in verse 33 of Jeremiah 31, but also Ezekiel 36 and verse 27, and that is the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. The reason why Israel has failed to keep the Mosaic covenant in the past was the people lacked the power to comply with the righteous standards of God. The Mosaic law did not provide the indwelling Holy Spirit, but that was not its purpose either. With the new covenant, it will do exactly that, and every Jew will be able to keep the righteous words of God because of the indwelling Holy Spirit. Every Jew will be indwelled by the Holy Spirit in that day. The seventh provision is that Israel will be showered with material blessings, according to Jeremiah 32 verse 41 and Ezekiel chapter 34 verses 25 to 27. The Mosaic covenant did provide material blessings for obedience, but for the most part of Israel's history they were in disobedience for the failure to keep the law and did not enjoy these material blessings. Now in the new covenant there'll be no failure, and so Israel will enjoy all of these spiritual blessings. Then the eighth provision found in Ezekiel chapter 37 verses 26 to 28 is the building of a sanctuary. And while the Davidic covenant provided for the building of the first temple by Solomon, the new covenant will provide for the building of the Messianic or the millennial temple, and this temple will be a continual reminder to Israel of all that God has done. We have more to say about the new covenant, but we'll have to do this tomorrow. Until then, we bid you shalom.